Good afternoon, good evening, good morning. Thank you to everyone who has decided to stay with us during the Cyber Stability Conference 2021. My name is Moderator and I am the moderator for this session. Just quickly, please remember, if you want to ask questions, please use the Slido platform. You can scan the QR code on the screen, or if you're in the room, you already have the details with you. So we are panel 6 of 7 for today on capacity building. And so in preparation for this, I actually went through the report of the open-ended working group and realized that capacity is actually mentioned 34 times, and actually 5 times before we even get to the chapter on capacity building. So on emerging and existing threats, the report indicates that states concluded that threats may be experienced differently by states according to their levels on, amongst others, capacity. On international law, states concluded that there was a need for additional neutral and objective efforts to build capacity in the areas of international law, national legislation, and policy. And further, international law actually has a recommendation. States in a position to do so should continue to support in a neutral and objective manner additional efforts to build capacity. And so this issue has been covered a lot in the open-ended working group consensus report, as well as the chair's summary. And you have also heard it being mentioned quite a bit in the previous panels. So throughout the deliberations of the open-ended working group, states underscored the linkages and synergies between each of the elements of the open-ended working group mandate. International law governs actions, non-binding norms provide additional guidance, and then on capacity building, states say it is an enabler for all states to contribute to increased stability and security globally. But member states have also identified a role for the UN with regards to capacity building, and have then encouraged the UN to continue to play the role in supporting states to raise the profile of capacity building by leveraging its convening power to support greater coordination of the variety of actors active in capacity building. But for today, we are looking at paragraph 57 of the open-ended working group consensus report, which, in addition to all the other areas that were covered, has made what I consider a quite substantive input in stating that capacity building is a reciprocal endeavour, a so-called two-way street in which participants learn from each other and where all sides benefit from the general improvement to global ICT security. And here's the fun bit. The value of South-South, South-North, triangular and regionally focused cooperation was also recalled. Now, these concepts and mechanisms have been embraced in various fields to a greater or larger extent. The question is, how do we operationalize this in the international ICT security space? And we're going to be looking and considering, are the current cyber capacity building trends reflective of the open-ended working group recommendations, including on these mechanisms, or are there gaps? How can the open-ended working group support capacity building? And what lessons are there for the cyber capacity building community as we look forward to a 5-year open-ended working group mandate? For those of you who are also new to these concepts, just a quick recap. Triangular cooperation, that is collaboration in which traditional donor countries and multilateral organizations facilitate South-South initiatives through provision of funding, training, technological systems, etc. South-South cooperation refers to the technical cooperation among developing countries in the global South. It is a tool used by states, international organizations, academics, civil society, and private sector to collaborate. North-South cooperation is a broad framework for development cooperation between the North, the developed countries, and the South, the developing countries, in the political, economic, social, cultural, and technical domains. Lastly, regional cooperation. This refers to the political and institutional mechanisms that countries in a general geographical region devise to find and strengthen common interests. Now, I'm not alone in discussing these things. I am joined by good friends and colleagues. I'm joined by Dr. Sharif Hashem, who is now a professor at George Mason University and a former GGE expert for Egypt. I'm also joined by Vopailin Shovishian, counselor from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Thailand. I'm also joined by Carolyn Weiser-Harris from the Global Cybersecurity Capacity Center, University of Oxford, and Patrick Pavlak, Executive Officer from the European Union Institute for Security Studies. Thank you all for joining me, and let's kick it off then. So, Vo, as a former open-ended working group delegate, do you think the current trends in cyber capacity building for countries like Thailand are reflective of what is in the open-ended working group report, or are there other models of cooperation that work better? What in Thailand's view has been your experience?
Good afternoon, everyone. Good morning. Here is the night time. It's 10 o'clock at night, so I'll try to stay awake. The open-ended working group recognize different forms of capacity building. It recognizes the value of South-South, South-North, triangular, regionally focused cooperation. But the more important thing is that it also laid down the principles for states to be guided by in the implementation process of the capacity building programs. These principles include process and purpose, and says that capacity building has to be a sustainable process. It's got to have clear purpose. It has to be politically neutral, respect state sovereignty. And also talk about partnerships that partnership has to be demand driven, and it's a shared but differentiated responsibility, and it got to respect confidentiality of national policies. And the OEWG also talk about people, respect human rights and fundamental freedoms, and confidentiality of sensitive freedoms. Of sensitive information. And I believe that each form of cooperation has its distinctive characters. For example, bilateral cooperation, which is probably one of the most common forms of cooperation that we can see. It can be easily executed, and it's a little bit more flexible than others in terms of the area of cooperation, because it only involves two sides. Regional cooperation, on the other hand, involves more parties, like in Thailand, is a part of ASEAN. It can be utilized in terms of experience and practice sharing, because it's got several parties in it, and especially in the global south, which has got similar sort of experience. And regional cooperation can also be utilized in forming consensus on some form of issues, such as understanding and implementation of norms responsible for state behaviors. And it also serves as a confidence building measure in the region. For Thailand, we have bilateral cooperation with several countries, and we also work in the framework of ASEAN as well as ASEAN plus dialogue partners, which includes China, the US, India, Australia, and Russia, and also the ASEAN Regional Forum, which has 27 parties, including the EU as well, and Russia and the US and others. I like to think that these regionally focused cooperative framework generally adheres to the guiding principle that are laid down by the OEWG, has clear purposes as laid out in the ASEAN Cybersecurity Cooperation Strategy, and it's demand-driven because it's it originated from our own region and politically neutral. And we also receive additional funding from our dialogue partners as well, which contributes to sustainability of the capacity building program. For example, here in Bangkok, we have the ASEAN-Japan Cybersecurity Capacity Building Center, which receives funding from Japan, of course, through the Japan ASEAN Integration Fund. So as you can see, we have different forms of cooperation. I haven't mentioned other forums, for example, the OSCE yet. So there are many types of cooperation that you can see, and this is also growing as well. APEC also touched upon the issues of cyber as well recently. So yeah, the OEWG covers these forms of cooperation, but we should also focus on the principle as well rather than form. Thank you.
So now I'm going to ask Patrick to come in here. So Patrick, you have covered cyber capacity building for years, and your organization has also recently published a report on cyber capacity building trends. Are there any new trends on the different cooperation mechanisms, including the ones highlighted? Vo spoke about the flexibility of bilateral cooperation and also the benefits of the regional. Are there any trends there, or are more trends in terms of principles and not necessarily form, as Vo just said?
Great. Thank you very much, Moliehi, for the invitation, and good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone. I will address two questions. The one you have asked, but also maybe the initial one about disparity between the open-ended working group report and the findings concerning different trends that we see in cyber capacity. Thank you for mentioning the report. Yes, it's the EOISS has published a report on trends that was commissioned and funded by the European Commission, but I cannot credit any credit for that report. It has been authored by Robert Collette and Naya Barbaliu, who were our experts for that specific assignment. Now, with regards to your question, is there anything new that we see? There is one specific aspect that I found particularly interesting when it comes to the direction in which the cyber capacity building is going, and that's the professionalization of capacity building, but specifically linked really to project design. And the report mentions really several examples of that. The one that I think is particularly relevant when we think about where cyber capacity building is going, and the maybe approach that I find particularly useful when it comes to ensuring sustainability of the cyber capacity building project, especially exactly when you think about North-South, trilateral cooperation and so on, is really this alternative models that are emerging to the conventional approach, which relies on flying in and flying out experts for cyber capacity building. So right now we see that actually more and more donors are approaching cyber capacity building from the perspective of deploying experts in the partner countries for longer periods. So it's not really this, a 3-day engagement over training, workshop, and so on, but really very often experts are really embedded in the national original structures. And then we have this trust building component really materializing, but also more sustainable transfer of knowledge and expertise. And just to give a few examples from the report itself, Japan's International Cooperation Agency, for instance, regularly uses a combination of Japanese experts who live in the project country for the duration of the project and work in the small teams with hired experts. So it's really not just relying on the expertise of Japan, but making sure that that expertise is sort of integrated with the local expertise. The World Bank, for instance, for the loan mechanisms in Ghana, has contracted Israeli company to deploy experts into their national incident response teams, who worked as part of the unit, for instance, and as trainers at the same time. So they're again contributing to this sort of a more permanent transfer of knowledge. Another useful example is, for instance, New Zealand, that has pioneered using secondments and reverse secondments between nationals of New Zealand and their counterparts teams in the Pacific partner countries. And finally, also let me bring the example from the EU that has, for instance, established the Latin American and the Caribbean Cyber Competence Center that's called LAC4. That will be hosted by the Dominican Republic with the aim really to serve as a hub for sharing collective expertise with the countries in the region. So again, we see this more permanent presence in the region rather than flying in and out. Now, let me maybe touch upon the point that you have flagged initially, this divergence maybe between what's in the report and the trends. And I think Vopelin has also mentioned this idea of principles. And I think, unfortunately, when I read the Open-Ended Working Group report, I see really a lot of interesting concepts. But when I think about them critically, I'm not necessarily sure that we're really following the principles and the ideas that we all ourselves put on the paper. So, for instance, the Open-Ended Working Group report talks about capacity building activities as being evidence-based, politically neutral, transparent, accountable, and without conditions. Now, if you really look at reality, I think we are quite far from where we are. So if you think about politically neutral, for instance, I think we can all agree that in the current geopolitical competition context, capacity building is really very often used as well as a political tool. So this political neutrality is really quite far from being achieved. When we talk about evidence-based, and I am pretty sure Caroline can cover that quite extensively, you know, we see very little countries sharing the information about what they do. So that also links to the transparency, which makes capacity building very difficult in terms of being evidence-based. And Robert and Naya in their report make that point very clearly. Now, they have done almost impossible thing with the annex to the report, which sort of collects a lot of empirical data on what specific countries are doing. Fun fact, again, that is very much northern based, right? So a lot of the information that we have comes from the north, but also from the traditional donors. So, and we always really rely on the countries that are willing to share the information. And I really hope Caroline can really talk about that, because the Sibyl portal that they're running has provided the big body of data actually that was used for the report. But we also understood very clearly by looking at the report what some of the shortcomings still are that need to be addressed. Transparency, I have really mentioned, you know, there's very little reporting on the funding, for instance, that the countries provide. And then accountability principle that's also mentioned in this in the specific point of the OEWG report. But accountability for what? You know, if you really look at capacity building projects, for instance, are we going to start looking at accountability of donors, which might unwillingly be creating some vulnerabilities in the partner countries through the capacity building projects that they're undertaking? So I think that's again something that that we have to look at. And one more point from the report as well, the OEWG report says capacity building should be based on mutual trust, be demand driven, correspond to nationally identified needs and priorities. Again, I really think that it's more of a wishful thinking rather than something that we observe in reality. If you think about the idea of mutual trust, I'm not really sure that this condition can be met when the recipients and the partner countries do not really have the capacity or the technical tools to verify whether, for instance, technology that's being offered to them can be really trusted, right? So we operate with this assumption of trust, but we also have to acknowledge that the partner countries really do not have the capacity to verify. So in the north, we talk about trust but verify, But in the South, we really hope that the partners will be only relying on trust. And I think that is quite an imbalanced relationship. And there are many more points, but I'm going to stop here and happy to go back to those during the discussion.
You have raised quite a number of things, and now as I hand it over to Carolyn, Carolyn, by virtue of the role that you have and the cyber maturity assessment processes, you get into the nitty-gritties of countries that are willing to share with you what they do have. And I know you also have a policy with regards to what you can publish and what you don't openly publish. But all of that then brings in some of the things that Patrick discussed around transparency and trust and all these things. But I'm also going to ask you the same question I asked Patrick. From what you do on the CMM side, what are some of the trends that you have seen, and how do you think that the recommendations of the open-ended working group are playing out in reality?
Thank you very much, and thank you also for inviting me to this excellent panel. It's a really interesting discussion. So first of all, it's a general trend, and I think that's also that I think this more regional focus. I see really there's some kind of momentum, awareness growing, and already seeing like kind of action that capacity building is more regional focus, which is I think is a good sign. So Patrick just referred to this new centers. The GFC has regional centers. We have established a global constellation of research centers. We have a center in partner center in Melbourne, which looks at the Oceania region. Since last year, we have a partner center in Cape Town. Both of those centers build this kind of locally capacity for doing this research and doing these assessments, but also developing a regional informed body of research and regional informed body of evidence, which is so very important. And you just you outlined like how important it is also in the report, that there are still a lot of countries which the community is still working on assumptions and sometimes even anecdotal knowledge to do capacity building, and there's still a lack of getting these evidence, doing this kind of assessments. I think when it comes to trust, I think we have shown with the implementation of the CMM in more than 86 countries around the world that governments trust the process. And they really value the process, multi-stakeholder process. The process is owned by the country. It's a multi-stakeholder process because you speak to all the experts in the country, or experts in the country from different groups, and the report is very detailed. But, and that's your right, the problem is that these reports, because the countries give this trust in the research team and the research teams in Melbourne, and Cape Town, and in us, they appreciate the findings, maybe share with the project partner for this assessment, for which maybe often the assessment is part of one project, but then they don't share the results with other partners. So there's clearly a gap because that's probably stops. I think there's I don't know, some of you know there was a report launched by the GFC 2 days ago about how linking the cybersecurity capacity building community with the development community. And also there's this lack of like sharing this evidence, and there's a lack of transparency, and there's also lack of like enabling collaboration, enabling better coordination, cooperation, because this evidence is then kind of like restricted to a team in the government, and it's not shared broadly. So saying that the trust unfortunately stops at a certain point, and that often hinders cooperation and coordination among those different efforts, because we still think there's evidence required. I think there's still a lot of things which are still not known. And even if I think the EU ISS report also shows that if there's no evidence, also there might be no incentives for funders to go into this field, because as funding is also always has to be accountable, people have to be accountable. Like funders also require some kind of like, does it actually make sense to do this investment? But if there's no kind of clear indicators what was successful, that's really a problem that can hinder funding. We do see a willingness to cooperate. I think there's a lot of demand to get support for capacity building, but I think it's also sometimes unclear, and I think it maybe has something to do with this different kind of communities, I think, which are outlined in both of the reports, the USISS report, but also in the GFC report, but also in all the different CMM reports, those which are public. That it sometimes depends on the community how cooperation can work. You know, sometimes it's an informal way, sometimes formal, sometimes it's really on a local level, sometimes it's really like backed by formal agreements. But I think there's still like, it's such a nice word and it's so important, but I think everyone understands something differently about it. So what is actually cooperation? So I just leave it by this for now and then hand over to back to you. Thank you.
I think from the three panelists, what we're hearing is to get capacity, you need capacity. To get the funding, you need to be willing to share certain things. And so those trust gaps are definitely something that need to be addressed. Dr. Sharif, I'm going to come to you now, and we're just going to take it back a bit. Clearly, a lot of progress has been done with regards to cyber capacity building. I don't imagine it was the same in 2012, 2013 when you were in the GGE. And so a lot has changed. But there's still this issue of what should the UN's role be? What should processes like the open-ended working group's role be, given what we've already heard before? And I'm interested to hear what you think we should be focusing on in this area.
And good morning, good afternoon to everybody. It's a pleasure to be here, and really I'd like to thank the UNIDIR for organizing such a really very special event. Let me start, and I'm glad that you're taking us a bit back. What do we mean by capacity building in a basic sense? And when it comes to cybersecurity, what are the real issues? In terms of cyber affects everybody, regionally, nationally, and internationally. When I mean everybody, I'm talking about governments, NGOs, academia, industry, and the general public. Also, I'm talking about, that it affects all critical sectors in our mind. It's not just about ICT. ICT is critical, but ICT in healthcare, ICT in financial, ICT in transport, you can add. Usually countries would have somewhere between 14 to 16 different sectors. So when it comes to capacity building, we have to realize that it's not just about training professionals, ICT professionals. It has been my experience in my home country and in my involvement with the African Union. I'm a member of the expert group on cybersecurity, and I've been in several groups within the UN over the past 20 years. And internationally, of course, the UNGGE. When people talk about cybersecurity capacity building, they're talking about technical capabilities in most cases. I'm glad since 2012, now we have seen cyber diplomacy and training diplomats, but definitely we need to do a bit more than that. If you want to train somebody in healthcare, you get sent by the technical people working in the healthcare sector. This is good, but I'm Egyptian, so I need to talk about the pyramids. We have pyramids of knowledge that we need to build. At the base, we have to have a solid base among professionals, a solid base among the general practitioners. But how about the top of the pyramid? The advanced, high-level decision makers in different circles, be able to assume the roles and responsibilities when it comes to implementing norms and CBMs. And they've been following the process for so long. And of course, we can always improve on them. There are lots of smart people working on this, I'm sure. The challenge that we all we all face now at this point in time is, how to make them a reality. When you talk about the responsibilities of states, responsibilities of the private sector, they need to understand. I'm talking about, at all levels. Decision makers. I remember a few years ago, there was a ransomware spreading across the world, WannaCry. The losses due to this ransomware was between $4 to $8 billion. It affected over 100 countries. Among them was, leading countries in Europe, quite mature, very much literate, highly funded. However, in the hospital system within that country, they were still using Windows XP, which was vulnerable. It was attacked. Medical records of patients were encrypted, and the hospital was not able to provide services to citizens. We're not talking about lack of medicines, lack of physicians, or lack of facilities. Everything was there except data was not there. We're talking about healthcare here. I just wanted to give this example to prepare for another point. So aside from pyramids, I need to also mention bridges. We need to bridge gaps and gaps of understanding between different professionals at all levels, starting from senior level, from the top down and bottom up, of course. They need to know the roles and responsibilities. If someone is responsible for an operation in a critical sector, in energy production, in transportation, they need to know that down deep, there could be a cyber attack that would cripple that critical sector. Decision makers at the level of a country, they need to know, while they, of course, need to channel funding for building infrastructure, which is really very much needed, cyber security or cyber threats can undermine their efforts. So this type of training is missing. Unfortunately, the vast majority of our attention has gone, there is a valid reason for training professionals, how to deal with the technology, with the techniques, AI, different, emerging technologies, Internet of Things, and this needs to happen and to continue. However, very little has been done in terms of war room exercises and tabletop exercises for decision makers. Without this, we are missing a big part of capacity building. We mentioned capacity building, and I've seen it mentioned in several, not just in the reports, several times today. However, I didn't see export controls. When countries approach export control relating to the tools and the trainings used for cybersecurity, there are debates how to make sure that the technology doesn't fall in the wrong hands. Let me tell you, as a professional, now I'm not representing governments anymore, so as a professional, criminals have an easier way getting access to technology. The problem is we have to train to be able, in developing countries especially, to develop the local expertise in training and awareness raising. Without the tools, our hands are tied. Patrick mentioned reciprocity. Reciprocity is really key also. Building trust between developing countries and more developed countries requires reciprocity in information and knowledge exchange. We have done this. We are privileged in Egypt to have been supported by Malaysia, US, South Korea, many European countries while developing our capacities 15 years ago. We also were privileged to be in a position to support Uganda, Tanzania, and many other African countries build their capacity. I come from a region of about 60 countries, Africa and the Middle East, and you can see a lot need to happen when it comes to capacity building beyond the trivial, approach of, having a training shop, here and there, or, bringing in an expert to fly them in and so forth. Endorsement of norms and CBMs is not just a checklist, it's a way of life. It's a way that we make this integrated across different sectors within the same country and across regions. I'd like to end my intervention here. I hope that they didn't cover too much, in terms of, the breadth of the topics, but really it is a broad topic and it's quite rich and quite central to having cyber stability.
We've got some very interesting questions that I can see now on the slide. But before I get to that question, Vo, I just want to come back to you. What do you think is the role of the UN? What do you think is the role of the open-ended working group to support cyber capacity building?
The OEWG's laid down principles of how capacity building should be guided. But that's probably not the only thing that the UN could contribute to this process. The OEWG/GTE's work, especially in the areas of norms, rules, and principles of responsible state behavior, as well as international law applicable in cyberspace, is really important because these work give guidance to states and regional corporations when it comes to capacity building. Well, ASEAN is one good example. It's the first regional organization to subscribe in principle to the 11 voluntary non-binding norms as set out in the GGE report. The ASEAN has embarked on the process of developing a plan of action to implement these norms. And even though it's still on the pipeline, but I believe it's a good start that we start discussing about this. So we can see that the work done at the UN level has contributed to building trust within the regional framework. And I think it is a good example that other regions should also follow such practice as well. And the room is still open for future roles of the UN. It could have more roles in fostering capacity building between states and perhaps between regions as well. It could do in the areas of matchmaking, identifying needs and support, and it could provide platforms for these purposes. And it also could support cooperation between national STARTs or even, something like global START, which is more or less similar to what is being on the pipeline of ASEAN, which is called ASEAN START, that helps or would help facilitate timely exchange of threats and cyber attack related information among ASEAN countries. And but these are the areas that need to be discussed further, and probably also it has to involve conversations on regular institutional dialogue as well, because regular institutional dialogue will help strengthen the role of the UN in these areas.
Patrick, I'm going to circle back to you now. In the first bit, you provided a number of examples that are shifting us from the model of fly in, fly out, the expert. And now I want to know if you've got some examples of these different mechanisms of cooperation that the open-ended working group has put as a recommendation, and if you think any of those could be edified by more UN involvement.
I've been trying to figure out exactly whether we have any practical examples that we can put on the table, and I have come up with a few, not very original, I must admit, but those that I think are, for me, quite a useful examples also in terms of the impact that they have had. And one of the projects that also we have identified in my organization as what we have called the Good Cyber Story, which is the project we have launched exactly to make sure that we can pick up on the initiatives that have this potential to be multiplied across the world, was, for instance, Glassy Plus. And Glassy Plus, for those who are not familiar, is the cybercrime capacity building oriented project, which is implemented by the Council of Europe with the funding of the EU. But the big advantage and difference that I see Glassy Plus has compared to other projects, and the reason probably why it's also so successful, is that actually it is very much implemented with the involvement of the partners on the ground, and actually gives them the ownership over some of the initiatives that are implemented as part of a Glassy Plus, really resulting in the South-South cooperation that you have been talking about. So for instance, you would have representatives of Sri Lanka providing trainings on law enforcement or how to fight cybercrime more effectively to other countries in the region, rather than rely on experts from the global north, let's call it that way. Similarly, in the Pacific region, you would have countries from the region, again, providing similar trainings and expertise, sharing expertise with their counterparts there. So I think this, for me, was is quite an interesting illustration how that could be done, even though when you have there's a bigger overarching framework that's being provided maybe or umbrella by the donors from the global north, still there are mechanisms to ensure that the implementation can be done with a proper ownership by the partner countries in the global south that also stimulate cooperation among them. And I think that's something that we can be definitely looking into. Again, there are many more projects I think that have a potential to become this seeds of South-South cooperation that we should be identifying and promoting. I have mentioned we have started with this with the Good Cyber Stories initiative, exactly because we believe that there is a potential for that. On the call, I think we have Hari Sufehmi, who is based in Indonesia, works for Mafindo, and they, for instance, have been doing very interesting projects that are linked to countering disinformation. Again, for us, that's one of the initiatives that could really serve as a sort of this core for sharing information about how countering disinformation could be addressed, especially in such difficult context of an island country that has such a huge territory to cover. But again, it can serve as a very good project to share lessons with others across the region and also globally. So these are a few musings that I would like to share to answer your not very easy question, because actually there are not so many of those projects that already exist. So I think there is a potential, but we really need to maybe accelerate. And why not use open-ended working group, but also the new idea of the program of action that has been floated that wants to have this very practical component of capacity building as a mechanism to leverage those projects that are on the ground.
And we've got 5 years in the open-ended working group, so a lot can be done to really put more meat on some of these concepts that we've already started discussing. I'm just going to pivot a bit now and take a question which is really provocative and very interesting to me, at least. Amir says, how can the open-ended working group deal with unilateral digital sanctions as barrier to capacity building? Recognizing non-discriminatory access to capacity building as a norm might help. So 2 things there, unilateral digital sanctions and possibly a new norm on non-discriminatory access to capacity building. Do I have any takers?
I'm happy to take it heads on. So Amir, the issue is not new. We have seen these proposals already coming up during the previous open-ended working group. Several countries have made the suggestions, Iran, for instance, arguing that indeed states should have this non-discriminatory access to capacity building and that sanctions are the mechanisms that really prevents them from accessing those capacities. Frankly, would I like to live in the world when non-discriminatory access to capacity building on cyber tools is accepted as a norm? No. Also because I see how those tools could be potentially abused. And, we do not have to look far. There are many authoritarian governments around the world who have actually used cyber tools to attack their own population, or have used those tools again to perform malicious activities against other countries. So I think we really have to acknowledge the fact that yes, capacity building at the non-discriminatory nature would be a great idea if everybody subscribed to really play by the rules. However, as we know, because the rules are voluntary and non-binding, many actors actually do not do that. So I would not like to give everybody, let's say, this huge power, but at the same time, not ensure that they will be held accountable whenever they abuse this power, and without having guarantee that they will use this power responsibly. And just to give one example, from the European background, European Union has done digital and cyber capacity building in Burma, Myanmar. We see several years later how those same tools can be potentially abused. So this idea of non-discriminatory and accountability and responsibility, I think, is something that really has to be balanced. But a great topic for discussion in the new open-ended working group. And I'm sure we're going to go back to that because I think it's one of the leftovers from the previous open-ended working group that maybe was not really discussed properly. So these are my reflections.
Carolyn, if you have any inputs on this, that would be great. But I also want to ask you one last question regarding the CMM and what, based on what you've learned conducting these CMMs, do you think is the future of the CMM, and how countries can play around with that as a tool to advance and promote some of these principles that came out of the open-ended working group.
We revised reviewed the CMM earlier this year in 2021, and one important new addition to the first dimension, which looks at cybersecurity strategy and policy, is actually an international cooperation and the capacity of a country to engage in this international discussions. Something which became obviously much more important and is now an indicator for a country to be mature. And there is a lack of that, and I think that's also probably where and more effort has to go into that countries actually can participate meaningfully in these processes. And in terms of I think that's where the CMM can be really helpful now and also in the future, is for a country to better understand actually what are our capacities and what are our positions of our experts, like what we need to do to actually be more can collaborate more meaningful and also can contribute more meaningful in those processes. I think what we are doing right now and what we're doing more now, it's also because the CMM has been deployed over almost 7 years now, is that countries do reassessments. So then you can see basically what happened within 4 years. Where was capacity built? Maybe which investments made sense, maybe some investments didn't make sense, where maybe projects really were not sustainable, which partnerships which didn't work, and where the country still has a lack to do this. I think that will be it's really important to better understand, not only for the countries, but also for the global community and for the regions, to better understand, okay, what works and what doesn't work, right? I think that was also one of the guiding reasons why the center was actually established. The other thing is, and I think that's becomes more and more important, is to link the CMM closer to national priorities and national development plans. So I think one thing where countries maybe were struggling with, they got the results from the CMM and they got a whole set of recommendations, because CMM has about almost 800 indicators. There's always a large set of recommendations, but it's often difficult or challenge for countries to actually do which of those recommendations do we implement first. And our plan is, and that's why we hope to help countries in regards those who are planning to, for instance, to go into smart cities, those who have development plans in terms of digital access, financial inclusion, that those recommendations are rather linked to those priorities. And we are working on our approach right now to do that and be more precise. It's like, okay, this is like the big picture of your gaps, and to reach the objectives of the development plan, this is the areas where we should build cybersecurity capacity. I think the other thing is definitely what I said earlier. We really want to build this regional capacity and local capacity of researchers. People can conduct assessments, can interpret assessments, can do capacity buildings, and really make it more like a build this regional body of evidence. And I think that will be very helpful for the countries, for the region. So the World Bank is going to launch a report very soon from the Western Balkans based on all the CMMs. I think it will really inform regional capacity building on the Western Balkans. All the CMMs were done by the World Bank and by us. So this will be a regional report basically combining these efforts. And the same as the center in Cape Town doing, they're just finalizing a regional study for the SADC region based on the CMM and the GCI, the Global Cybersecurity Index by the ITU. So really give recommendations also for regional organizations. And the Organization of American States is preparing their third iteration of their regional report. So we hope through this more publications, because these regional reports will definitely be published, that this also informs governments and regional organizations and funders and implementers to better build projects and implement projects and spend funds more efficiently. Thank you.
I think one of the things that we've learned from this panel, myself at least, is sometimes it's the kind of questions that we are asking when we look at the open-ended working report than just taking it at face value. And one of those questions that has consistently come up is around funding, for instance. We've already discussed that. We've discussed issues of transparency and trust. But Dr. Sharif, I want to ask you now this question. Are there areas in cyber capacity building discussions in the open-ended working group that we haven't given enough attention to that we need to focus on in the next 5 years? And borrowing from your experience, AU Cyber Security Expert Group, as well as your current role and previous roles, do you have any things that you think we need to be considering a bit more?
Actually, we have globally witnessed the rapid digital transformation due to the COVID pandemic. We have seen a lot of countries now trying to race to catch up with economic development. Again, I'll go back to Africa and the Middle East region. Many countries suffered dramatic setbacks in the developmental plans, and they didn't have enough infrastructure to cater for this. So I think it's really important to look for models and issues that are related to economic development empowerment through cyber stability to add value, because addressing cybersecurity on its own is seen as, either a financial obligation or operational obligation. But the way cybersecurity avail digital transformation that in turn empower economies is the way to really advertise for this and really raise awareness, build capacity when it comes to decision makers in various sectors while they are facing hardship, how to adopt, models that would be based on the norms and the accepted CBMs and so forth, would be globally accepted, also regionally accepted, to empower their community and to reach better, safety and security. I talked in my earlier intervention about building bridges. I am a board member of FIRST. We have seen the chairman of the board speaking earlier today. We organize regional events, including a regional symposia for Africa and the Middle East, where we share experiences. I'd like to invite you all to join us on the 7th of December. And we have special training program for managers and operators, technical people for 2 days, from the 7th to the 9th of December. This is organized for the 6th year in a row for that region. 60 countries. We have participants from over 60 countries, including African, Arab, and international participants as well, to try to bring people together, to build bridges across different disciplines. We have support from regional organizations, the African Union, the ITU, being a UN agency, global, GFCE. They are also with us. We have all the friends of the development in Africa and the Middle East. So partnership is key, and multi-stakeholderism is key. We have private sector, very strong participation from governments, from academia. The point about research, many of the issues need to be researched further. To build capacity means all of this. So I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to all of you, and I look forward to the next steps moving forward. Thank you.
I think there's one more leftover that I see in the report that I think would be interesting maybe to address in the ongoing round. And that's this idea that a few countries, including Egypt, have put in their submissions, which is that of a common but differentiated responsibility when we talk about capacity building. He said at the beginning that capacity building is mentioned in all sections of the report when it comes to norms, international law, and confidence building measures. So what I would like to maybe hear more of in the deliberations is, what do states mean when they say that they would like to see common but differentiated responsibility? Does that mean that they want to be, they want to have less responsibility when it comes to compliance with norms, international law, or confidence building measures? What is it really that we're talking about? And I think there are different approaches to that question, but we have not, again, discussed that properly. It was mentioned in a few submissions to the OEWG, and I think that's, again, an issue that, at least from my perspective, would be interesting to address. Thank you.
CPDR, right? I'm also going to be looking forward to that discussion, and maybe that's another opportunity to build a bridge with another community that has been dealing with CBDR for a while. Vo, before I let you go, what do you think we need to discuss more of in the next open-ended working group?
I think we need to move on from what we have already discussed earlier into the way forward and discuss the next step. And as you can see, we clearly lack much cooperation on capacity building at the international level. And I think that's something that we should focus more on. And also, I think the OEWG didn't really pay much attention to the involvement of the private sector. Not only as the recipients of the capacity building, but also what the private sector and how they can contribute to the process, especially in developing countries. Thank you.
In a minute, Carolyn.
I think we have to really discuss what cooperation really means. What does it mean for different kind of communities, and what can be really the practical implication of that. So this touches coordination, that touches building trust, that touches building relationships, and it really touches like on building, and I think that's what Patrick said earlier, professionalizing the different departments, agencies, etc. So people have the skills and the knowledge actually to do that.
With that, I would just like to say thank you to all the panelists. And we are going to break now. Please stay tuned for the next and final panel. Thank you so much.